The story of Noah and the ark is one of the most misunderstood stories in all the world. Certainly one of the most misunderstood stories in the Bible. It is more than a story about a man and a boat and animals and a flood. It's the story of grace, and it's the story of faith that brought this man from a wicked and horrible world into a new existence where he could have a closer union and relationship with God. It's a story of a fresh start. It's a story of judgment. It's a story of redemption. So I hope you have your Bibles and you can open them to Genesis chapter 6 as we look at this most remarkable story in Scripture.
Ben's Bible Study, Ben's Bible Study. This is a Bible study by Ben, but you are invited to be my friend and join into the discussion. Ben's Bible Study.
Okay, I want to pick up in Genesis 6 and verse number 1 again. I'm not going to read through it all, but just to refresh our memory. The world was extremely wicked. And if things were to go in the same direction that they were, some terrible things were presumably going to happen. The Bible is emphasizing in these first 8 verses of Genesis 6 just how wicked the world is. But we're going to see that again in verses 11 and 12. The earth was corrupt before God. It was filled with violence. God looked on the earth. Indeed, it was corrupt. All the flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. I mean, there's an emphasis that's pretty clear, right? 3 times in these 2 verses, the word corrupted is used, and then also the word violence is used to describe this world. So God is going to destroy the world. That's what we find out in those first eight verses of the chapter. But then we're introduced to Noah in verse number 8. It says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse number 6, the story then transitions to really focusing and letting us know who this Noah individual was. It says this is the genealogy of Noah, or this is the history of Noah. That Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, and Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then again, the world was corrupt. We read those passages. I want to begin, we're going to get into the ark in just a minute, but I want to begin by pointing out some things that are said about Noah. These are connected with the statement in verse number 8 of why Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. I made a point in the last video that more than anything, the grace that is being spoken of in verse number 8 is being spoken of the grace, the salvation from the physical judgment that the earth was going to face. So God gave Noah the instructions, and we'll read about him, to build the ark to be saved. That's the grace that's in reference here. But when we read the characterization of Noah in verse number 9, we need to also understand that just based on these statements, that Noah had also received spiritual grace. Think about it again. In verse number 9, it says that Noah was righteous. Noah was righteous. And this would be more of a general term from the comparative standpoint. Compared to the rest of the world, Noah was righteous. Now, it's not saying that Noah was sinless. We know that the Bible teaches that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans chapter 3 and verse number 3. There is none righteous, no, not one. So we know that it's not saying that he was, an absolutely righteous person, but God viewed Noah as a righteous individual. That's how he is being described here. But then he's also described as being perfect in his generations. And this expression has to do with the fact that he was blameless among the contemporaries of his time. So, like, no charge could be levied against Noah. He walked upright. So comparatively, he was more concerned with right and wrong than the rest of the people of his day and time. He lived in such a way to where no one could really accuse him of committing any evil. But then we have this third description of his character, that Noah walked with God. He walked with God. And what that expression would have us understand is that Noah had a relationship with God. And so while the two previous expressions, that Noah was righteous and that he was perfect in all of his generations, while we can look at that as comparatively to the rest of the people in that day and time, he was more, righteous. There is also the fact, because it says that he walked with God, that Noah had a spiritual relationship with God. So he was righteous in the sense of his sins being forgiven. He's made perfect in the eyes of God. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse number 22, we're told about Enoch. And it says that Enoch walked with God 300 years and had daughters. In verse number 24, it says Enoch walked with God and God took him. Enoch was taken up into paradise, and the reason that he was taken up into paradise is because he walked with God. He had a relationship with God. In Genesis chapter 48, let me go over to Genesis chapter 48 and verse number 15. Jacob is blessing his sons. He starts, in this instance, he's blessing Joseph, and he says, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day. He's blessing Joseph from or through a blessing that ultimately is coming from God. And he makes this statement that Abraham and Isaac walked before him. Abraham and Isaac would be people of faith, people who had relationships with God. And the word before there, it really has to do with the presence of God. Jacob is saying Abraham and Isaac lived in a relationship with God. Their sins were forgiven. They were righteous. Remember, Abraham believed God, and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. So there's a statement of relationship. So I believe it's a really interesting thing, going back to Genesis chapter 6, that Noah found grace. And again, while we're going to look specifically at grace in the context of the physical, escaping the physical wickedness of the world and escaping the physical judgment that's going to come upon the world, we can't overlook the fact that we also have clues that Noah obviously had received spiritual grace from God. So he was right with God. These three terms together let us know that he was right with God. But I think it's also worth pointing out that the three terms separate from each other speak to the fact that Noah was active in the life path that he chose. So it wasn't some, there's this doctrine of like grace alone, where there's nothing that you do. God just makes you righteous, and it's all up to him. Noah was a righteous person. He was somebody who had a relationship with God. But Noah was active and making the decision for himself, I want to live different from the rest of the world. I want to be somebody who is going to be blameless in this world. I want to be somebody who walks with God. So you see the personal responsibility when you separate these three terms, but then you see the grace of God when you combine them together. But it's important to make this point, because why was it that God needed to destroy the world? And it's important because of the fact that Jesus was coming to this earth. And he, at this point, needed to come to the earth. This is a fascinating thing to me, and I don't know the answer to it. But it seems to be the case that if men were left to their own devices, they would have done something that would have removed the possibility of Jesus being able to come to this earth and accomplish what he was going to do. And I don't know if that has to do with the genealogy. That's a major component to Jesus of Nazareth, is that he was a historical person. In Matthew chapter 1, tracks his genealogy all the way back to Adam. That's an important fact about Jesus. You can track him. He's a historical figure. So I don't know if the threat was to that component, that the genealogy would have been wiped out and the record keeping would be wiped out and it would become a completely anarchistic society. I don't know if that's what it would have been, or if mankind would have ultimately, left to their own devices, would have literally destroyed themselves. I think that's a possibility. Either case, the threat, I believe, is definitely a threat to Jesus being able to come to this earth and accomplish his mission, which is to pay the price for sin. And here's what makes it so important that God does something. Well, there were already people, and we know Enoch. All right, if all we have is Enoch, that's all we need. But I'm sure there were others through the lineage of Seth and people who also walked with God, who received the forgiveness of their sins back in this day and time. Enoch was taken. Enoch's sins were forgiven. But here's the conundrum. Sins had not yet been paid for. Sins were forgiven before Jesus came, but sins were not yet paid for. Listen to this passage. Let me get another Bible open here so I can look at some other passages. But look at Hebrews chapter 9 and verse number 15. It says, "For this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant." His death was for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. The sins were forgiven, but the sin debt had not been paid for until Jesus died on the cross. And what's interesting along those same lines, Galatians chapter 4 and verse number 4, it says, "When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons." There was a time that that God set for himself based on his own righteousness, to where God was going, he forgave sins without yet paying for it. But God predetermined for himself, based again on his own righteousness, not some cosmic deal that was made between him and the devil, but because of God's own righteousness, God set a time to when payment was due. And when the fullness of time was come, he sent forth his Son, who was born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. Now, in that context, it's not talking about the sins of the people in times past, but in that particular time period, redeeming the people of that time who were under the law. But the point is, when the fullness of time came, when according to God's set time period of when it was time to pay for the sins, he sent forth his Son. So this world, back in Genesis chapter 6, is on this destructive path. And again, I don't know where we would end up if mankind was left to their own devices. Would they have destroyed themselves, destroyed all humans? Presumably, I think that's very possible and maybe even probable. Or would they have destroyed the genealogy, the traceable genealogy of Christ, which would cause people to believe in him less? I don't know which one of those is true, but I think either one of those introduces the conundrum of, okay, well, what about those people whose sins were already forgiven? That's an interesting question to me. I don't know if you could even speculate the answer of what it would be. What would God have done with Enoch? If Noah wasn't living and he destroyed all of mankind, what would God have done? I don't know the answer to that question. So that's one of the reasons that God had to destroy the earth. It was because of Christ who was coming, and he needed to protect the salvation of the people whose sins were already forgiven, and then provide continual forgiveness to all those who would come to him. But then secondly, God needed to destroy the world, or not needed to, but his destruction of the world, it serves as a type for the final judgment. And here's some interesting components, connections between Noah and the flood and that judgment and the final judgment. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse number 7, it says, "By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." And so look at these connections between the judgment that we see in Genesis chapter 6 and the final judgment. Noah was saved by faith, and those who are going to be saved in the final judgment will be saved whether they have faith or not. Jesus said, "Unless you believe that I am he, you will all die in your sins." So those who were saved then were saved by faith. Those who will be saved when Jesus returns will be saved by faith. Those who were saved were brought into a new world. Those who were saved by Christ will be brought into a new world, a new heavens, new earth, as it's spoken of in 2 Peter chapter 3, which is just an expression of our new existence with God in heaven. Those who were unrighteous were destroyed. Those who are unrighteous when Jesus returns, they will be destroyed, not annihilated, but eternally destroyed, eternal punishment, hell that lasts forever. And then I think a very, very important point is with that initial salvation of Noah and his household, we see that few were saved. 8 righteous souls were saved through the ark. And what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse number 13, and I'll pull that up. He says, enter by the narrow gate, and broad, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. There are many who go in by it, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Noah was saved, him and his family, 8 souls were saved. Jesus said salvation is going to be received by few people. So there's a lot of similarities between the judgment, the flood, and the final judgment. And so God destroyed the world for, I believe, those 2 central reasons: to protect Christ, his coming and his payment for the sins, that all sins that are forgiven, and then also to give us a type of the antitype, the shadow for the fullness, which is the final judgment, when Jesus returns and destroys all the elements of this earth. Going back to Genesis chapter 6, again, I think verses 11 and 12 are really important. The emphasis on the corruption of the world. The word corrupted is used 3 times. Everything was ruined. Everything was decaying. There was injustice. Everything was marred. Nothing was right in the world. And it was a good thing for Noah, the person who was trying to live right, that God did what he did. In verse number 13, we get to the ark. And we'll get into this a little bit. We're going to talk about some things about the ark. And is it a believable story? And look, you're going to hear a lot of people out there that will just mock and laugh at the ark. And they'll throw out these statements. And they'll say that, oh, this is impossible. This is a myth. And what we're going to do is we're just going to, again, like we've tried to do so far, is we're just going to take the Bible for what it says and how it presents itself. And then we're going to ask these questions as we go through. Is it possible? Is it possible? Because if it's possible, this is going to sound really stupid, then it's not impossible. And if it's not impossible, what's the big deal? So, I think people don't want it to be true because people want to live the way that they want to live. But that doesn't mean it's not true. And so we got to take it for what it says and then ask the question, is it possible? And let's get into it. In verse number 13 all the way down through verse number 22, we have the instructions for the ark, and then Noah following through and building it. It says that God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So that's interesting. He's going to use the earth to destroy the earth. He says, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. And what is gopher wood? Well, there's a lot of people that will speculate and tell you what gopher wood is. No one really knows. It seems to be that most people believe that it was some kind of cypress wood. That's fine with me. I don't know what it was. What I know is that it was a type of wood that Noah made an ark out of. So I don't know. Verse number 14, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark. or nests is what I believe the word literally means. Make nests in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And that pitch, what was that? Well, it was something to seal the ark, make it waterproof. That could have been a tar, a sap. Maybe there were some asphalt pits or something that were close by. We don't necessarily know exactly what it was, but similar to what people do today with boats. They take something and they waterproof them. You can get something that is natural. You can get something that is man-made. The presumption, I think, is that Noah was taking something natural and applying it to the ark. But then we get into some things that I think are interesting and worth talking about. Verse number 15, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. Now, let's pause right there for just a second and let's talk about these dimensions. 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. These dimensions become really interesting in light of a study that was done in 1993. I believe it was done in South Korea, but now my memory's slipping on that. I believe it was done in South Korea, but it was done at a ship research center. And in the study, they were just asking the question, is the ark viable based on what we have in Genesis chapter 6? Like, could it have been made and could it have floated? And would it have been successful? And so they took 12 different types of ship proportions. So this proportion, 30 by 50 by 30, that'd be one proportion. And then they took different proportioned ships and they put them through a variety of tests. And none of the other ships outperformed the ship that was made under these proportions, the 30 by 50 by 30 proportions. And the study proved that the ark described in the Bible would be the perfect vessel for what is being described in the flood. It would be balanced, it would be strong, it would be able to withstand waves that were maybe up to 100 feet tall, which the flood isn't just rain coming down. I mean, what's being described, and when we get into chapter 7, is something extremely violent. And for what is being described in that storm and all of that, this proportion is perfect. It's amazing. And it's not like they were, expert shipbuilders back in the day. Now I have a link in the description I'll put for an article that goes a little bit deeper into the study from Answers in Genesis.org. But here's what's interesting about that study that was done. The man who was leading it was a man by the name of Dr. Hong, and he was not a creationist. He was just asking the question and then letting the experiment take him where it did. And it took him to the conclusion that what we're reading about in Genesis chapter 6, based on those proportions, would have been perfectly capable in doing what is being described in these two chapters, in Genesis, three chapters, Genesis 6, 7, and 8. People have questioned what it looks like. No one really knows, obviously, what it looks like. But there is the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, and they do a pretty good job of imagining it without stepping out of the realm of possibilities. They're not making it fanciful. They're imagining and taking some license, along the way because they don't know, but doing a really good job, I think, of making a rendering of what it very well could have been. If you ever get a chance to go up there, I've been before. It's worth it. It's pretty interesting. Now, that's just dealing with the ability to float, the ability to withstand the storm, and all of that. Those proportions, we don't know the exact measurement of a cubit. It was basically from the elbow to the wrist or to the fingertips, depending on the culture and the time period where a cubit was used. So the cubit's going to change from generation to generation, as someone might be in charge. The king might have had a really long arm, and so the cubit might have been 20 inches or 18 inches. But a conservative estimate would be that the ark was about 450 feet by 45 feet by 75 feet. So people say, well, there wouldn't have been enough room on the ark for all of the animals. But just to kind of give some perspective of how much room we're talking about, this would equate to a train with 527 cars behind it, and depending on the length of a cubit and then the length of a train car as well, it could be from 527 train cars to 1,250 train cars. And that comes out to the length of the train is 5 miles, roughly, just short of 5 miles long. That would give a cargo capacity of 1.5 million cubic feet. We're not talking about, like the picture that you've seen where it's this boat and then you got the giraffe head sticking out and you're like, well, they couldn't have fit anything else. No, we're talking about a huge, huge ship. It had 3 decks in it that are described in the account. And the decks would have accounted for 100,000 square feet of floor space. Each deck the total of the 3 decks would account for 100,000 square feet. So the people who are saying there wouldn't be enough room, well, let's slow down a little bit. And let's ask the question, would there be enough room? What are we talking about here? So they'd say, how in the world could you have enough room, and they'll use big numbers, when there are 11 million different species on the planet? You got to get all 11 million different species on the ark. How in the world would you have room? And, well, let's just stop and ask the question before we're overrun with the sensationalism. Let's ask the question: was everything on the ark that was on the earth? One issue with the charge of there's 11 million species. How are you going to get them all on the ark? Is that is the projection. That's what they assume the number actually is, when in reality there's 1.8 million known species. I'm not saying that they're wrong that there's not 11 million species. I'm just saying, let's deal with the numbers. We know of 1.8 million species, and we can't necessarily trust the models, even though it's kind of a moot point as we continue to go, because many of the species that they would have listed in there would never be on the ark in the first place. You got plants and fungus and bacteria, you got insects, you got fish, you got amphibians, you got so many species that would never be on the ark. Noah might have some seeds, but he's not going to bring like a redwood tree on the ark. And another issue with that is when you go back to the actual text, it says in verse number 20, of the birds bring after their kind, of the animals after their kind, every creeping thing on the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So what is being said here, and there's going to be debates, and the definition of species and kinds in the scientific community might change because they might debate on it. But the Bible has its own definitions for a kind, and a kind is something that can reproduce within it. So there might be, one kind. It might have a multiplicity of species that come after it. Like, for example, canine is a kind. But you have, wolves, you have coyotes, you have, the dogs. You have these species that come from the kind. So the Bible says to bring the kinds, not every single type of animal that is out there. Noah definitely had a representation of all of the animals that would have died, the kinds of animals that would have died if they didn't get on the ark. But he didn't have the animals that could have lived by not getting on the ark, such as plants and fish and certain amphibians. So let's tweak it down and adjust for what the Bible is actually saying. The Bible is saying he's to take the kinds and specifically the animals that would need to be on the ark to survive the flood. Not all animals would need to be on the ark to survive the flood. Now, when somebody reduces it down to what the Bible actually says, one scientist recognized that would make the number about 16,000 animals. 16,000 animals that represent the different kinds or ranks. And so with that number, which is it's a high number. It's the higher estimate of trying to figure out how many animals there were. 16,000 is the higher number when we reduce it down to, kinds and things that could reproduce within themselves. So taking that number and then accounting for the fact that they needed room for food, they needed room for waste, they needed room for water, they needed room for themselves to sleep. When you factor all that in, the results are, there's more than enough room on the ark to do what Noah was required to do. And I'll leave a link in the description for an article from Apologetics Press that goes a lot deeper into that species and kind conversation and provides a number of resources beyond just their article that you can look into. Verse number 16, the ark was supposed to have a window. You shall make a window for the ark, and you will cover it, or you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. There's a little bit of difficulty with the word window. The common assumption and the criticism is that Noah built a window that was basically like 18 inches by 18 inches on the top of the ark, on the top part of the side of the ark. 18 by 18 inches on this vessel that we're talking about that's 450 feet long. It's like, what's even the point of that window? So people make fun of it and say there was no ventilation on the ark and this and that. Well, to that, we need to, again, be honest with the text and appreciate that this is difficult. The word used here in Genesis chapter 6 and verse number 16 is a difficult word. It's not the normal word that is used for window. The normal word for window is used in Genesis 8 and verse number 6, where it says that Noah opened up a window, and that word is different. There's two different words that are used in Genesis 6:16 and in Genesis 8 and verse number 6. And so what some have wondered, and the text would allow for this, is some have wondered if Noah built like a span of lights on the top of the ark that were 18 by 18 inches. Each one of them was. And then when he was told by God to open up the window in Genesis 8 and verse number 6, he opened up one of those windows. So what's being described is, Noah, you need to install a light system in the ark in Genesis 6 and verse number 16. And then in Genesis 8 and verse number 6, open up one of those light systems that you had built. It's not really an issue, but it's just to let you know, critics will attack that, but the text doesn't necessitate the criticism. You're making more of it than really is there to make. Verse number 17. Let me get back up there. God says, I'm bringing floodwaters to the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you. You shall go in the ark, you and your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh. You will bring 2 of every sort in the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. And verse 20 is to me the most interesting verse. I can't say that. It's a very interesting verse in this chapter. It says, of the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And it says that they will come to you. They will come to you. You know, I'd love to have seen that. Now, what it looks like to me as we flip ahead in Genesis chapter 7, where we get into the floods coming now, the ark is made. In chapter 7 and verse number 7, it says, so Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, they went into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and in everything that creeps on the earth. 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. So what it appears to me is that there were 2 parts to this. Noah went out and he gathered the animals and probably stationed them near the ark. So that was his responsibility. Then when it was time to get on the ark, Noah got on the ark first, and God caused those animals 2 by 2 to walk into that ark. That's an amazing scene for me to imagine in my mind. He says, they will come to you. So Noah had to go round up the animals, but when the flood came, God got more involved in a more direct way and caused them to file in line. I wonder if Noah was surprised at all, as these animals are just not killing each other and walking into the ark. Okay. Now, verse number 22 of Genesis chapter 6. So important. So important. And we're going to get lost in the conversation about the ark and the critics, people who attack the story. But I would say that Genesis 6 and verse number 22 might be the most important verse of the chapter, at least for our own application. It says, thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did. You go back to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse number 7. Well, back to verse number 6. It says, without faith it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Noah did everything that the Lord had commanded him. And the writer of Hebrews uses that as an example of faith that we all need to have. If you want to be pleasing to God, you need to have faith. And Noah is an example of faith. And what is his example? Well, God warned him. God spoke to him. God gave him word of what he wanted Noah to do. And everything that God told Noah to do, Noah did it. He acted by faith. It's interesting that every example of strong faith in the Bible is one that is obedient. And serious attempts are made by the individual to obey God. But we live in a world today where faith alone is presented as, if you do anything, you're going to develop this mindset that God owes you salvation. So it's faith alone. Just believe. All you need to do is believe. Accept Jesus into your heart, and you're going to be right with God. But yet every example of true faithfulness that we have throughout the Old Testament are people who obeyed God, who did what he said. I believe we're getting it wrong, the way that faith is presented. If Noah was the average person of faith today, the verse would read like this. It would read, instead of going back to Genesis 6 and verse 22, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. The verse would read like this today. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded. Noah was going to do it, but then he began to argue with God about how God doesn't know what grace is. Noah had already found grace in the eyes of God. He didn't need to do anything. In fact, if Noah thought he needed to do anything to be saved from the flood, it would no longer be grace. So God built the ark and put Noah in it. That's the modern theological approach to faith and salvation. That if I ever do anything, I've earned salvation and it's no longer grace. But Noah gives us this example that makes all of that so ridiculous. What's harder to do? Build an ark or to just obey the gospel? It's like people don't understand that salvation has always been, from the days of Noah to the days of now, salvation has always been by grace through faith. And there have always been conditions to receive the grace, and nothing has changed. There are still conditions to receive the grace that God has given through his Son. Even though Noah had built an ark, he did not earn his salvation. He didn't. His salvation was still by grace. And when we read the New Testament and we read what Jesus says we need to do to be saved, in Mark 16:16, Jesus says, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that does not believe will be condemned. Now, if Jesus says if you want to be saved, you need to believe and be baptized, how can I turn around and say, no, because if I'm baptized, I'm earning my salvation, which is what so many people say? I mean, think about it and be honest. What is harder? Is being baptized harder than building an ark? No. But Noah was saved by grace. But he was saved because he built the ark by faith, doing all that God had commanded him to do. That's what he did. And because he was faithful, he received the grace that God had offered to him. We're getting it wrong with this attitude that we have, this misunderstanding of what faith and grace is. We've destroyed true faith through all of these teachings and traditions that have been passed down in these cliches. Just accept Jesus into your heart. No, obey Jesus. Obey from the heart that form of doctrine. Romans chapter 6 and verse number 17. That's biblical. Just accept Jesus into your heart as your personal Lord and Savior. Nowhere to be found. And I believe we look at these Old Testament examples like Noah. Noah gives us an example of which of these options is right. The option of true faith that will save is, if God says it, I'm going to do it. And I'm not earning anything. I'm just being faithful to the God who has offered me the grace, the forgiveness of my sins, the salvation from the judgment to come. Thank you for sticking with me through this video. Please like and subscribe if you don't mind. It would really help me out a lot and help boost the availability of this video to other people. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time.